There's been a rare display of rage and frustration in Cuba, where thousands of people have called for an end to the decades-old dictatorship. They're demanding food and vaccines as the country's dire economic crisis only worsens during the pandemic. Discontent has been growing over the past year, but the scale of the protests has taken many by surprise. Maddock reports.
Spontaneous and simultaneous, Cubans haven't seen a day like this in decades. Shouting for freedom, the country erupted in discontent. In a nation known for brutal crackdowns on dissent, it was an astonishing show against the communist dictatorship. Economic misery has been slowly festering, but a week of constant blackouts sparked people to get out of the dark and onto the streets.
We are here because of the repression against the people. They are starving us to death. Havana is collapsing. We have no house, we have nothing, but they have money to build hotels and they have us starving.
The day of unrest began in San Antonio de los Banos, a small city not far from the capital. People saw what was happening on social media and joined in. The outburst of anger took authorities by surprise. They put on an obvious act of force, arresting many, using pepper spray and batons. They were more discreet elsewhere, as plainclothes officers infiltrated and beat up protesters.
The people came out to express themselves freely, and they are repressing and beating them. That's unacceptable. We are nobody. But we are here to support protesters and not allow them to be beaten.
President Miguel Diaz-Canel went to Ground Zero to placate, but protesters had a lot to say to him. This woman says she has no electricity to cook food. The president simply told her it's because there's no fuel. He gave no indication he would act on their concerns. Instead, called on supporters to confront protesters.
We won't allow Cubans to be influenced by the government of the US to provoke destabilization in our country. We call upon all the revolutionaries of the country, all the communists, to take to the streets where these provocations are going to take place today, from now on, and in the following days.
The US State Department did counter, saying it was deeply concerned by the calls to combat. Protesters echoed the same sentiments, saying leaders should be calling for peace and dialogue, not blood. Maddock, TRT World.
Well, for more, let's go to Emily Morris in London. She's a development economist specialising in Latin America and the Caribbean. She's also a research associate at the University College London's Institute of the Americas. Good to have you back with us, Emily. Firstly, protests on this scale would have been unthinkable under either of the Castros, frankly. Why are Cubans prepared to show their dissent at this time?
I'm not sure that it's that they're prepared to. I think the level of frustration and economic hardship is acute at the moment. And so people are expressing their frustration and they've come out on the street. I suppose what you've seen there is just the San Antonio de los Banos event happened because of power cuts initially, and people can't cook their rice and beans and so on, and so they've been they're just protesting against hardship, really. And they kind of feel that the authorities aren't doing enough. It's an interesting situation because, in fact, the government's been struggling over the last few months to ensure that everybody has enough food and fuel and all the rest of it, but there simply isn't enough at the moment.
Now, President Miguel Diaz-Canel said while many protesters were sincere, some of them were also being manipulated by, quote, US orchestrated social media campaigns and mercenaries on the ground. Is there any truth to that?
Well, yes, there's been a very long history of this relationship between the US and Cuba, and between the Cuban Americans, the lobby there, the exiles from Cuba who left years ago, has been going on for decades, ever since the revolution in 1959. So there's been a long, long history of the people from outside trying to influence politics inside. And that, of course, makes the government's response one of suspicion. And it means it's actually inhibited Cubans from having an open debate because people feel that they'd be labeled as acting in the interest of foreigners. So this is how the discussion is always going on. Cuba is a very small country. It's a very vulnerable economy. And it's next to a very large one that's been attempting for many, many years to weaken the economy and cause such frustrations.
The Diaz-Canel government tried to introduce some limited economic reforms at the start of the year. For example, it sharply devalued the peso. It also allowed for more freedom within its private sector. Was Cuba on the right track under this current government?
Well, it's interesting because they call one of the demands is calling for economic reforms. And this year, they've actually seen the most radical economic reform to date. And what it's done is it's caused a lot of economic disruption as well. And so you've had an enormous change in relative prices in the economy, and you've had winners and losers. And some of the biggest losers have been people who were formerly operating in the informal economy. So with COVID, the informal economy has contracted dramatically. I mean, it's almost disappeared. The informal economy that was flourishing before, which was related to international visitors. And so all of those people who are dependent on that economy have found themselves with very, very little. They're simply depending on food for which they have to queue for hours. Their incomes have plummeted. The US government's made it even more difficult to send remittances. And so, you've got a whole section of society who are really facing very extreme hardship. And kind of, on the one hand, they're more dependent on the state because it's the state that's providing them with food and social security. But on the other hand, they feel that they should get more because they're losing out against everybody else.
Cuba's economy, as we know, has also been suffering under the weight of US sanctions. They were partially lifted under Barack Obama, then reimposed under Donald Trump. And there's hope that perhaps the Biden administration might look to ease them again. To what extent is Cuba's economy suffering under US restrictions?
Well, they were reimposed under Trump, as you say, but more than that, they're actually now more severe than they've been ever before. And the reason is that in January, actually just before Biden took office, on top of all of the other restrictions that the Trump administration had imposed on travel, remittances, finance, trade, and so on, and imports of fuel, the listing of Cuba relisting of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism under current conditions when the banks and international businesses are all de-risking because of fear of US sanctions, means that the Cubans have been blocked from doing trade. They don't have any access to external finance. They can't get any financing from the IMF, which has been given emergency finance to other countries. And so with COVID combined with the sanctions,
yes,
they're really in a very, very difficult place economically.
Okay, Dr. Emily Morris, we'll have to leave it there. But thank you so much again for sharing with us your analysis. We appreciate it.